That's not worked at all. That has not worked at all. This would be a definite go around from this point. Look at that. Absolutely shocking. Go around flaps. Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot. And today, a bit of a special video. We're going to talk about that approach I did on a live stream recently into Innsbruck, where we flew the localizer approach to runway 26 with the intention of circling to land on 08, and it didn't go quite as planned. Today we're going to have an honest look at what we could have done differently and how we will get through it, as well as going to go and obviously fly the approach properly today. As ever, I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but none of this is for any real-world use. It's just for our use in home simulators to hopefully give you some extra context. And today, what I'm hoping to do is provide a bit of an insight into how we sort of debrief these days after we've had a simulator session or something like that, so we can try and learn from what happened, just to give you a bit of an idea, as well as a better look at the circling procedure in Innsbruck. We'll be using the Toliss A321 in X-Plane 11, and we are about to enter the hold at Romeo Tango Tango before beginning the approach, and I'll talk through what happened before. So for those of you who didn't see the flight, we flew from London Heathrow to Innsbruck, and I'm going to show you a few clips from that video just to show you some of the highlights of where some things didn't go as we had hoped. To start off with, we did correctly predict the weather was not going to be in our favour. We prepared for the RNAV approach down the Western Valley, so to RNAV approach to landing on 08, which is what I had expected a possibility of being given the wind on the ground. We briefed this approach, the RNAV, onto 08 before running into some failures which took up some time out of the flight, as you can imagine, as we ran through them. And here's a clip of that happening. They might use this runway even if there's a westerly wind the whole way. Oh no. Oh dear. Master caution. Right, okay. This took a bit of time to resolve, but once it was, we began preparing for the approach again and realised that the runway in use had changed end. The ATIS was not available to tell us the exact runway. It was working, but it did not include which runway was in use. This is something that in real life you might phone ahead to the control tower to find out in advance what approach to expect. Something like that could really help out your workload. But as we hadn't done that, we found that we ended up having to swap the briefing and start again. It's a bit strange that their ATIS isn't showing which runway they're landing on. Are they still in the tower? Yeah, they are. Well, now it's actually that they're using 26. As you can tell, not an ideal flight by any means so far, especially for such a complicated approach. I want to be clear that I had practiced the simpler straight-in approaches on either end of the runway, but I was not expecting to have to fly the more complicated circling approach procedures. I am also well aware that airlines have many of their own procedures that they use for these approaches because of the sheer complexity, and all crews that go would have had special training in the simulator. I have not had this training, so cannot talk with authority on this approach. I want to be very clear about that. So next we then ran into yet another issue as the simulator crashed on us. Send level 130 match 249. Oh no. Ah, you're joking. Obviously, this was very disappointing, and I was starting now to run out of time for my stream, as a flight that I thought would take an hour and a half was now going to seriously start adding up. I want to now fast forward to the stage of the approach where it all really unravels as we do our circling manoeuvre and end up too close to the runway and therefore have to go around. In aviation these days, we try to find the root cause of the problem, so when we are debriefing something that didn't go as planned, we don't want to just say what went wrong, and we'll see that very shortly. We want to find out why it went wrong. So let's have a look at what went wrong. Yeah, I don't think this is tight enough. I don't think it's tight enough with that wind pushing us through. Yes, that was definitely too tight in for that circle. No, that's not worked at all. That has not worked at all. This would be a definite go around from this point. Look at that, absolutely shocking. So go around is what we did, and we went off, and that was unfortunately where I ran out of time to carry on with the stream. So how did we end up in that situation? Well, if we go back to the start of the approach, back up to 9,500 feet, we attempted to begin the localizer approach that we had been expecting, which sadly unraveled pretty quickly. It's just not showing up, is it? It's not showing up. Due to limitations in X-Plane 11, the localizer did not show up that far out, which was not something I was aware of as I had not practiced this approach in this simulator. Subsequently then, we asked air traffic control for the RNAV instead, which we went and flew, and soon we found ourselves rebriefing this next approach type number 3 for the day. So we set up and fly the RNAV approach onto the westerly runway, and we begin our descent, and things are starting to look a bit like they are on the up. As we begin down, we get our first news that we may actually have to circle off this approach, which is not something we've briefed or prepared for, and I make the observation that we would definitely go around in real life. You would not be pushed into this without being prepared. Hey.
Innsbruck Tower, good evening, wind check 260 degrees, 8 knots, expect circling approach, runway 08, continue.
We are now unprepared for this approach, and we are also in the wrong configuration. So I point out to the viewers that we would absolutely do a go around in real life and not continue with this approach. Now, I'm going to be honest, guys. Let's go to flat 3. You wouldn't do this in real life. This would be a go around to go and replan this, because that was a bit of a curve, but we weren't ready for there. I then point out that the winds are not favourable for this, as we had very strong winds down the approach that could lead to the tailwind being too strong to fly the circling correctly. The combination of these factors means that the approach is not prepared properly, and I end up briefing from a chart that I'm not familiar with, and as you'll see, I make some wrong assumptions about the distances to the valley. The end result we've all seen, which is that we end up far too tight in for the turn. Here's some of my assumptions that are wrong. So I think if I follow this visually, I don't think this is the scale. Usually these aren't special circling procedures. Yeah, I don't want to get any closer, so let's turn downwind. So where is the church?
1000.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of an example of how the problem was that we turned too tight in on approach and therefore could not line ourselves up with the runway, combined with a strong tailwind, which meant that our rate of descent needed to be so high on that turn that we didn't maintain enough rate of descent because we were not briefed properly for it, and therefore we were too high on the approach to continue. The problem came from the fact that we had changed approach so many times earlier that we had not given ourselves enough time to really dig into those charts and understand that we needed to be closer to those hills on the left to give ourselves room to make the turn. I'm now going to go through the approach, showing you how it can be done properly. Again, not reference material. I'm not trained to do this approach. I just want to show you how it can be done differently from what I did on the stream. Okay, so here we are in the hold at Romeo Tango Tango, and we are now going to have a go at flying the localizer DME approach and then circle to land down at the other end. So it will hopefully work out a little bit better. Let's have a look at what we're going to do. Here on the charts then, if I can make that bigger for you, we can see we are here at the Romeo Tango Tango hold, 9,500 feet. We are going to leave this hold eventually, fly to Adwig, and then thankfully I can use nav mode just to get ourselves onto the localizer, because as we saw, there are some limitations to using the localizer that far out in X-Plane 11. I'm going to try and use the full ILS because I believe there should be a glide slope modelled. However, if that doesn't work, at 19 miles we'll begin our descent using track FPA and descend at the steeper approach angle that we're going to use today of 3.77 or 3.8 degrees. We're going to fly that down to our circling minima, which we need to see at 1910. We will be config with gear down and config 3. As we reach 4.2 miles inbound, gear down config 3, we're going to push to level off before we reach 3,700 feet, the minimum circling altitude. We have these different percentage gradients for the go around, but we'll imagine that we meet the 5% gradient. We will turn 230, fly downwind. This time we will get closer to those hills, over the power lines which are shown on the charts, and we can then fly along and look for that church. I believe there's another building there as well. As I said, lots of great resources on YouTube that I should have watched before I did this, so this will not be a complete tutorial. There are lots of great videos about how to do this already. And as I said earlier, it's highly likely that every airline that flies here has many of their own procedures in place to account for all of these differences, because this is an unusual chart with no real reference for the downwind except visual. It's a purely visual maneuver, and I just wasn't prepared for how close to that hill would have to be. We can see here we'll be 3,700 feet. The terrain right next to us is 4,000 feet, so it will be above us, and then 5,000 feet just there. And at times we could have a radio altimeter of maybe below 1,000 feet on the downwind leg, so we need to be prepared for that. At 3.5 OEV, we will then make our right turn back around to land in. We'll start our turn around this church, descending at 1,000 feet per minute and hopefully line up. As I said earlier, the winds are favourable today for the circling. We have an easterly wind, so the wind is coming down the valley, and these are the conditions you would normally expect to circle, not quite as strong winds as we had earlier. So this will mean we have a tailwind down the approach, hence we'll need to be gear down flap 3. Then we will fly this level and turn into the headwind to land, hopefully on runway 08. Let's set it up in the MCDU now. So I'll bring up the MCDU. On the flight plan page, I can show you, and I'll just go to plan. As we scroll through, we're going to leave the RTT hold, head to Adwig, fly down the localizer, and then break off to go and do our circle maneuver here. In RadNav, we have the Oscar Echo Victor tuned as VOR1, so I can display VOR1, but actually we don't need it. We've got it tuned as an ILS, so let's bring up the LS. And funnily enough, it is already identing here on the PFD as we are at 24 miles. It's just not displaying. You'll notice on this chart, one of the many warnings hidden in here, due to the mountains, the coverage of the localizer Oscar Echo Victor and DME is restricted to 27 miles. But we know that actually in X-Plane it seemed that it didn't actually work until we were a bit closer. There is another note saying ensure the Oscar Echo Victor localizer DME is properly identified overhead the NDB Romeo Tango Tango, which is where we are pretty much in the hold. But it is working now, and we shall see later on. But we have a plan. If not, if the glide slope doesn't work or the localizer doesn't work, we will need to go and do an RNAV again. That means we also need to tune for the circling. I'm going to tune the NDB, the 420. Now this is going to go into box 2, and I'm going to display NDB 2. So if we go to ARC, and I press that across, there we go, the 420 is in there. Now that's the INN. It's not too useful because there's no reference to what it needs to be. We can see we pretty much have to be west of it before turning downwind, so it's just another sort of backup. I'm also going to, in the flight plan page, just to help me out, I'm going to put in the Oscar Echo Victor as a fixed info page, and then we'll put 3 miles. Oh no, Oscar Echo Victor, and then I'll put a 3-mile radius ring. The reason I'm doing that is so I can get a rough idea of when I need to be ready to start that turn on base leg. I could put another one in at 4 miles to remind me to turn downwind. So actually, let's try that. So let's put in Oscar Echo Victor. And again, airlines will have their own procedures for this. I'm going to have a 4-mile ring. So we'll pass the 4-mile ring, at which point we should have turned downwind. And then as we pass the 3-mile ring, and I can show you on the plan. So 4-mile ring going inbound, we'll turn downwind, and then once we pass that inner ring, we'll make our right turn back round into land. Not sure if that's a good idea. Could get confusing. We shall see. There's the RadNav page now tuned. So we have our Oscar Echo Victor and our NDB. Progress page, I'm going to put in the threshold that I'm landing on to help me out. So LOWI 08. Performance page now. Let's load in the weather. As I said, these are more favourable conditions, but the principle is still the same, but it's just a bit of a headwind for the final approach. And minima. Now the minima is still going to be our circling minima, which is 3,700 feet. So I'm actually going to put 3,700. We need to be visual at 3,700 feet, or this won't really work. Config full for landing. And then our thrust reduction acceleration altitude, which we talked about in the stream, we need to set, depending on your airline procedures, higher. But I'm going to leave that today. As I said, this is not a full tutorial. This is just to see the approach done properly, or at least hopefully so that it works. Right, fuel prediction. We have plenty of extra fuel. Secondary is important now. I'm going to copy the active, but then, as we did before, I'm going to change the arrival. I'm not going to put any approach in. I'm just going to have a runway 08 and insert. So now I am going to clear out some of these points. Oh no, there we go. Right, so if I clear out Adwig, I can't clear out RTT. Okay, there we go. So the secondary now should sequence to the center fix. So that is what I'm going to activate when we are downwind. Okay. We now have a bit of a plan. So what we're going to do is go and give this approach a go, fly down the localizer, level off at 3,700, circle round, get closer to the base of those hills, keep that turn tight, turn into a headwind, and hopefully land off of this approach. Before we set off, let us activate the approach phase, which it has, which is great news. I'm not entirely sure. Here we go. Let's clear out these messages that might help us on the PFD. That top of descent reach message is obviously going to stay there. And yet again, this will be a max reverse, medium auto brake landing. Right, we are now leaving the hold. Here we go. So we are going to Adwig. I've got the Oscar Echo Victor identified as is required for this approach. Let's start configuring. So we'll go manage speed, flaps to 1. Remember, we are descending from 19 miles, but I'm been told on good authority that in X-Plane it won't work this far out, so we hopefully will have it working by 19 miles. I'll keep the chart up as well, full screen for you. Alright, here we go then. Let's go to flaps 2. Put the gear down. Right. Oscar Echo Victor is still identified, which is good news, but we don't have it displayed. Let's go to flaps 3. And it should stay at F speed. We don't want flaps full yet, and in reality we don't actually need to be quite this configured, but I'm just making it as slow as possible for us. So at Adrig, 9,500 feet, we should intercept the localizer at 21 miles. It's still not displaying, so what I'm going to do is just wait and let it fly on in nav mode, which would have helped me. I could have done this, but we were radar vectored. Now I could have extended the centerline out and done it using nav mode anyway. It would have worked, but again, these things are all very easy to say in hindsight. I was hoping it would work, or assuming it would work. There we go. It's just appeared at 21 miles. So let's put lock on. There's lock star, and we're seeing a glide slope coming. So we're supposed to intercept that glide slope at 19 miles. So it looks sensible. So I'm actually, it's not letting me arm the approach. Perhaps because it knows this is a localizer only. It's very interesting. So we are going to start our descent using FPA. So I'm going to pre-arm the 3.7 or 3.8, sorry, and then at 19.3 start down. There we go. So FPA minus 3.8, and we'll have a glide slope visually for ourselves, and we can also check our altitudes on here. So 18 miles, we should be at 9,100 feet. I'm going to leave that going altitude in of 9,500. Again, quite surprised it hasn't let us capture the approach, but there we go, it's not taking it. Not a situation I've seen. We don't do localizer approaches very often at all. The radio altimeter came alive there, no surprise. We've got terrain underneath us the whole way down, so we're just going to keep our altitude checks. 17 miles, we should be at 8,700 feet, and we have that handy glide slope and the little donut showing us we are on profile. Now the gear is down, so we can arm the ground spoilers. Let's give the cabin crew the ding dong and put the last lights on. Okay, here we go then. So this is going to be all the way down with that tailwind as well, you can see. So it's requiring a 1,200 feet per minute just to maintain that glide slope. Incredibly steep. And next one at 16 miles. We should be 8,300 feet. Looking good on the profile. Right, we are now at 14 miles. We should be 7,500 feet. 14.075. We're getting slightly low because that angle is slightly wrong. Only about 10 feet, so we'll do 3.7 for a mile or so just to let it balance out. So the next event now is we're going to get ready to level off at our circling altitude. Our circling altitude is 3,700 feet. And it is going to happen around 4.2 OEV. So what I'm going to do is give myself a bit of a buffer. So at about 3,800 feet, I'm going to push to level off. You should do it with about 10% of your vertical speed to make it work. So if we're doing 1,200 feet per minute at that time, I'll actually push to level off slightly sooner, maybe about 120 feet high. About 10% tends to work out. Okay, next check then. At 11 miles, we should be 6,300 feet. And let's hope we can find some of these landmarks this time. 11 miles on profile. I'm going to leave it at 3.7 and then see where we end up. There is the runway, as you can see. So if we were doing the straight in, we'd have no trouble from here. 2 whites, 2 reds. Just convert, follow the landmarks in for the straight in, which is what I had hoped to do in the stream. What I had imagined would be more likely, or alternatively landing in on the easterly runway. Let's have a check at 9 miles of 5,500 feet. Again, quite handy having that glide slope displayed. It seems to be giving us quite useful information. So it's good to know it does eventually work. And yeah, interesting that the approach is locked out, it seems, in the aeroplane. Again, we so rarely fly localizer only approaches. And if we were, we wouldn't usually try to arm the approach once it's tuned in there. Right. Altitude still looks good. 8 miles. We're looking for 5,100 feet. Eight miles, 5,100. Tiny bit high now, so let's go to 3.8 for this last bit. We are visual, so we're ready to circle. You do have the option of circling slightly higher in a lot of airports, but this is not a standard circling, as we've discovered, so we will not mess around like that. I'm going to move on from this chart now, because we are visual, and I'm going to carry on to 4.2 OEV. On my navigation display, we drew a ring around it, so this first ring is about 4 miles, so by that point I need to turn onto 230. We are already in track FPA, so that should be pretty straightforward. It turns out this chart is pretty much to scale, which I was not aware of. It's very rare and you don't normally rely on charts like this. Another thing to point out is we don't actually fly with a moving aircraft on our charts. I certainly never have. It is possible on some charts, but you wouldn't fly an approach checking where you are. I know it is possible, but it's not an improved way of navigating. Okay, here we go then, coming up to our 3.7, so at 3.8 I'm going to push to level off. Okay, so there we are, push to level off now. We are visual obviously for the circling, and there we are at 3,700 feet, 4.2. I need to turn left onto 230 degrees in track, which we are. Now I'm going to see that according to my nav display that's correct. We're passing our outer circle, and now, as I've seen from those other tutorial videos, here's the ski jump. Again, these videos are very good, so I highly recommend having a look at some of them. Right, 230 degrees, we're going to take ourselves over to the second set of power lines. It seems that there is one set here you can just make out, and there is another set over here. So we are going to be over on that second set. It is a remarkable approach, seriously close to those hills, and this is why pilots will be trained specifically for it, because it's just so different to what we are used to doing. You can see as well that wind is pushing me slightly, or it has, from my 4.2, so we're ever so slightly tight in, but it won't affect our turn here. I'm also expecting GPWS systems to go off, and again, I'm not sure what the airline procedures are in this specific airport. It's a very unique case. So 3,700 feet level, we're going to turn onto track of 264. Only once we're downwind, I will activate that secondary flight plan.
Terrain.
There's our first warning, but I'm not going to let it distract me. However, that is not what you'd expect to have, but I imagine the aircraft are fitted, or there is a procedure for that. But certainly we didn't get it last time because we were much further to the right. Okay, let's start that turn downwind now onto 264. Again, so close to these hills. Let's see if this works. There's us going below 1,000 feet on the radio altimeter, as I expected to happen. Right, so we are now turning, and here's that power line, which we are running parallel to. If we look out the front now, we may have more luck at finding that visual cue of the church. As I said, this is such a remarkable approach. So we're going to keep on going to 3.5 OEV. I've got my ring on the navigation display showing me that inner ring. Okay, so now we are downwind. Let me go into the secondary flight plan. I'm going to activate the secondary flight plan, and then I'm going to do a direct to the center fix and put a radial in of 256 on my navigation display. When I enter that into the radial in, we'll get a straight line, and I can insert that. And then I need to pull the track again to keep us on track of 264. That way we have a rough centerline for us out there. We've got just about half a mile to go outside, so let's take out the autopilot off. Flight directors are both off. That church has not appeared in front of us, so we'll get to 3.5, start our right turn and our descent. This is where you would be really handy to have other pilots with you. Okay, 3.5, going to almost 30 degrees of bank, putting the nose down, just a couple of degrees to get to 1,000 feet per minute. I'm going to select the speed because there appears to be a bit of a bug in my Toliss, and go to flap full. Cabin should be checked already, and we'll keep 1,000 feet per minute as we come round this turn. Now I'm going to turn off the GPWS system, but that's not realistic. You wouldn't do that in the real airplane, but there must be some procedures because the Toliss has a habit of shouting for the rest of the flight if I don't do that. Right, let's select that VLS plus 5 around about there. You would have your VAP already calculated. I can see on my navigation display that I'm coming in on that center line, which is good news. And we're keeping 1,000 feet per minute, so there's a little bit too much descent there. So let's try and get that under control. There's the runway with 3 whites, so actually we need to keep the descent coming. And there's still 1 red, so I'm going to do about 1,000 feet per minute.
Caution terrain. Caution terrain.
Try and get myself down. We have a headwind now. There's 2 whites, 2 reds. Bit too much descent there, so let's bring that back under control. And now we have 2 whites, 2 reds, and we'll take this down to a landing. It is, as you can see, an incredibly busy approach. Something we could also try and do is get that inbound track set up properly. Again, that's going to be a job for the other pilots. There just wouldn't be time for you to do it yourself necessarily in this context. So there we are. We made it round the turn. As you can see, pretty much 30 degrees of bank needed, even in perfect conditions, to make it in onto the final approach here.
400.
Likewise, there is just a lot to do in the last stage of that downwind.
300.
Correcting that 3 reds.
200.
Not getting too focused on the pappies now, just driving the airplane in towards the middle of that touchdown zone.
100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. 10. 5.
There's touchdown. Max reverse. Make sure we get those spoilers. Reverses are green and decel. Then we reach 70 knots, idle the reversers, no problems. And there we go. That would have been what we would hope to happen. I'll go to manual brakes, forward idle. That's what we would have hoped to see on the stream, but sadly, through a combination of factors, we did not manage. But there we go. Some of the lessons I've learned about this approach, and even these, as I said, are not going to be much use to you in anything real world. This is purely just to show you how you might have a go in a simulator, and I hope it's been of interest to you. It's always very important we try and learn from our mistakes, of course, so it's been an interesting experience for me to get to do that with you guys. I want to thank everyone for their support. I had lots of nice messages during and after the last stream, and thank you all for watching and enjoying it. It really means a lot to me, as ever. So that is the end of today's video. Luckily finishing on the ground in Innsbruck, having done the circling approach. There'll be plenty more tutorials and live streams coming soon on the channel, so do please stay tuned for those. Like and subscribe if you'd like to see them, and they'll be coming to the channel very soon. As ever, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in those future videos or streams. Bye bye.